Hanoi, October 1967. In the humid air of Gia Lam Airfield, the dawn was gray with smoke and the faint smell of burned jet fuel. Captain Nguyen Van Thach, an aeronautical engineer assigned to the People's Air Defense Command, stood beside a twisted wreck of American aluminum and titanium. The wreck had been dragged here from the jungle 2 days earlier. The remains of an F-105 Thunderchief shot down by Soviet-supplied SA-2 missiles north of Thanh Hoa. The aircraft was nearly intact, a rarity. The pilot had ejected, captured alive. The machine that lay before Thach was more than just debris. It was, as his superior put it, a glimpse into the mind of the American Empire. Thach had studied engineering in Moscow before returning home to work on maintenance procedures for the MiG-17 and MiG-21 fleets. He was methodical, skeptical, and fluent in the language of numbers. When he first saw the Thunderchief up close, he felt what the German engineer Schultz had once felt decades earlier when facing the P-47, a quiet, unsettling awe. The F-105 looked impossibly large. It was a single-seat fighter bomber that weighed over 20 tons loaded, twice that of a MiG-21. Its fuselage was enormous, dominated by an air intake and a cavernous bomb bay. It looked less like a fighter than a small jet airliner modified for war. Yet the Americans had been sending hundreds of them over the north, day after day, as if they were disposable. Thach began his inspection with the engine. When his team peeled away the battered panels of the fuselage, a massive cylinder of metal was revealed, the Pratt and Whitney J-75 P-19 turbojet. It was, quite simply, the most advanced piece of machinery Thach had ever seen. The engine's compressor stages gleamed even after exposure to heat and shrapnel. The tolerances were perfect. He ran his fingers along the precision-machined edges of the turbine blades, feeling the difference between this and the rougher Soviet designs he worked with daily. "This engine," he murmured, "is built like a clock that breathes fire." He took out his notebook. The J-75 produced over 26,000 pounds of thrust with afterburner, almost twice the output of the Tamansky R-11F used in the MiG-21. It allowed the Thunderchief to break Mach 2, even while carrying a bomb load heavier than an entire MiG. But more than the raw numbers, it was the consistency of the engineering that disturbed him. Every fastener, every connection, every hydraulic line spoke of mass-produced precision. Vietnam could not manufacture a bicycle bearing to that tolerance. Even the Soviet Union, he thought, would have struggled to match this exacting standard in quantity. He and his technicians cataloged each component: titanium alloys in the compressor discs, heat-resistant Inconel in the turbine section, and perfectly routed electrical harnesses. None of it looked improvised or hurried. It looked industrially serene, the product of a nation that built power plants the way others built rice paddies. One of Thach's assistants pointed to a section of tubing running beneath the engine. "Comrade Captain, this part survived the missile impact. The material, it bends but does not crack." Thach examined it. It was a high-temperature nickel alloy, something he had seen only in technical manuals from the West. It could withstand temperatures that would melt Soviet steel. The Americans weren't merely designing for performance. They were designing for endurance, for infinite replacements, for war without exhaustion. He jotted another note. "They build as though failure does not exist. Each component expects to be replaced, but none expects to fail." The more he studied, the more he realized that the Thunderchief wasn't just a fighter bomber. It was a statement, a machine conceived by a nation whose economy was limitless. He moved to the avionics bay. Rows of black boxes lined the compartment, each labeled with English words: radar receiver, ECM unit, navigation computer. He had seen radar in MiGs before, but this was different. The F-105 carried an entire suite of electronic countermeasures, capable of detecting and jamming enemy radar systems. Soviet advisors had mentioned such equipment, but to see it here, in a downed aircraft, was like seeing a ghost of the future. He turned one of the boxes in his hands. Inside was a miniature circuit board, not vacuum tubes, but transistors. Dozens of them. Thach stared, silent. The Soviets were only beginning to transition from tube to transistor technology in their aircraft. Here was an American plane, built years earlier, already operating in the solid-state age. It was lighter, faster, more reliable. "They are fighting a digital war," Thach whispered. And we are still in the analog age. That realization chilled him more than any bomb. He turned back to the fuselage. The structure was thick, reinforced, layered with aluminum and titanium. He counted the rivets in one section, more than 200 in a single panel. It was redundant, overbuilt, almost arrogant. Soviet aircraft, like the MiG-21, were designed for simplicity, small, efficient, fragile in comparison. The Americans, by contrast, built their machines to absorb punishment, to survive even when crippled. The reports from anti-aircraft units suddenly made sense. There were stories of Thunderchiefs returning to base with wings shredded, control surfaces missing, holes the size of barrels through the fuselage, and still flying. Looking at this wreck, Thach could see why. He examined the cockpit next. The seat was an advanced Republic-Weber ejection system, complete with automatic sequencing for canopy jettison, rocket motor, and drogue stabilization. Every control was duplicated, redundant, labeled in clear English letters. He pressed the buttons, imagining the pilot's last moments. Even the cockpit armor was substantial, thick steel plates behind the seat, armored glass in front. The F-105 pilot, he thought, sat inside a fortress that moved at twice the speed of sound. When he looked over the weapon systems, his sense of unease deepened. The Thunderchief could carry up to 14,000 pounds of bombs, or 4 times what a MiG could manage. It could also launch radar-guided missiles, something his own Air Force couldn't yet field. And this was not an experimental aircraft. It was one of hundreds, even thousands, operating daily over the jungles of his country. He closed his notebook slowly. "We can shoot them down," he said to his team, "but we cannot match them." The realization was heavy, like the humid air around him. Later that night, back in his quarters, he wrote his preliminary report. He described the Thunderchief as a weapon system beyond the technical reach of the North Vietnamese or even their Soviet patrons. He noted the industrial complexity of the engine, the electronic sophistication of its avionics, the quality of its materials. His conclusion was grim. The United States does not merely fight with machines. It fights with industry. Each aircraft is a symbol of a production capacity that defies comprehension. They can lose 100 and build 100 more. We cannot afford even one. He stopped writing for a moment and looked out the window. The sound of distant explosions rolled across Hanoi, another night raid. Somewhere above, hundreds of aircraft like the one he had studied were dropping their payloads. He wondered if any of them were already being replaced, rolling out of assembly lines in Texas or Kansas, thousands of miles away, even as their predecessors burned over Vietnam. And for the first time, Nguyen Van Thach understood what kind of war they were truly fighting. Not a war of courage or tactics, but a war of capacity. 3 days after his initial inspection, Captain Nguyen Van Thach stood before a long wooden table inside a Soviet advisory office near the Yen Vien rail junction. The air was heavy with the scent of machine oil and cigarette smoke. On the wall behind him hung portraits of Ho Chi Minh and Lenin. Across the table sat 2 Soviet colonels and a Vietnamese general. The table was covered in photographs, sketches, and fragments of the captured F-105's components. Thach began his presentation carefully, speaking in slow, technical Russian. "Comrades, the American aircraft recovered near Tan Hoa is identified as F-105D Thunderchief, serial number 62 to 431. Examination indicates an extremely advanced propulsion system, Pratt and Whitney J-75 turbojet, capable of thrust levels exceeding 26,000 pounds. Comparable Soviet engines do not reach this performance without twin-engine configurations." One of the Soviet colonels, a stout man with the pale skin of northern latitudes, leaned forward. "Yes, we are familiar with their engines. What is your assessment of its combat significance?" Thach hesitated before answering. "It means they can deliver enormous payloads from high altitude at speeds we cannot intercept with the MiG-17. Even the MiG-21 struggles to catch the Thunderchief when it dives." The colonel frowned, taking a drag of his cigarette. "But they lose many aircraft. Their losses are unsustainable." Thach nodded. "Yes, but they replace them faster than we can destroy them. Our intelligence suggests the United States produced over 700 F-105's in a single year. Even if we shoot down one each day, they will still outnumber us before the next monsoon season." There was silence. The Vietnamese general, a quiet man with a thin mustache, spoke softly. Comrade Captain, are you suggesting our resistance is futile? Thach straightened immediately. No, sir. I'm suggesting that this war cannot be won through air combat alone. They fight with factories the size of provinces. Every aircraft is not just a machine. It is an industrial statement. They build in months what would take us decades. He unfolded a large sheet of paper, a hand-drawn schematic of the J-75 engine. He pointed to the compressor stages. Each of these blades is made of a nickel alloy resistant to 1,000 degrees Celsius. This requires technology we do not possess. Our factories cannot melt or machine such alloys without foreign equipment. Yet the Americans mass-produce them. The Soviet colonel looked unimpressed. We produce our own turbines for the MiG-21. They work. Thach nodded respectfully. Yes, but theirs last longer. Their maintenance cycles are measured in hundreds of flight hours. Ours are measured in dozens. The colonel waved a dismissive hand. Durability is an American obsession. They build heavy and slow. We build for maneuver and simplicity. But Thach didn't back down. Comrade Colonel, the Thunderchief is both heavy and fast. They've transcended the trade-off. They have engines powerful enough to carry the extra weight, and factories capable of building them in numbers. They can afford inefficiency because they are infinitely supplied. He could see the colonel's expression tighten, not with disagreement, but with discomfort. The Soviet officer knew the truth, but ideology required denial. To admit American superiority was to question socialist industry itself. The Vietnamese general cleared his throat. Let us focus on practical recommendations, Captain. Thach nodded. Yes, sir. My report recommends avoiding engagements with the F-105 at altitude. The aircraft is vulnerable only during attack runs and recovery. Ground-based missiles remain our most effective countermeasure. The general scribbled notes, but did not look up. Understood. Thach exhaled quietly. The meeting would end with polite nods and official approval, and then his report would disappear into a filing cabinet, marked classified. That night, he returned to his quarters and wrote a personal addendum to his official report, not for command, but for himself. Our enemies build with an abundance we cannot imagine. Each rivet, each transistor, each alloy is part of a vast machine of production that dwarfs nations. The Thunderchief is not a marvel of engineering alone. It is proof of their system scale. They have turned wealth into metal and metal into flight. We fight them with courage, but courage cannot be mass-produced. Weeks passed. Hanoi burned again and again under Operation Rolling Thunder. Each night, the city's sky turned into a canvas of tracer fire and orange blossoms of flak. Each morning, Thach heard new counts of downed American planes and new photographs of others arriving to take their place. He visited a repair depot on the outskirts of the city where wrecks of American and Soviet-built machines lay side by side. The contrast was haunting. The MiGs were light, fragile, their thin aluminum skins punctured and torn. The Thunderchief fragments, by contrast, were thick, unyielding, even burned. They looked indestructible. A young mechanic handed Thach a piece of wing from the F-105. Comrade Captain, we melted this section in a furnace yesterday. It resisted longer than anything we've seen. Even the steel turned soft before it did. Thach examined the alloy again, the shimmering traces of titanium. They don't build for scarcity, he murmured. They build for permanence. He had read reports from American newspapers smuggled through third countries. They spoke casually of industrial output, of assembly lines in Kansas City producing 2 aircraft per day, of spare parts shipped across oceans. To Americans, production was logistics. To the Vietnamese, it was a miracle. He began to understand something larger. The Thunderchief was not designed to be efficient in the narrow sense. It was designed to embody a philosophy that quantity and quality were no longer opposites when a nation had mastered industrial abundance. In December, Thach was summoned to the Soviet compound again, this time to brief a delegation from Moscow. He arrived early, carrying his updated findings. The visitors were older men, bureaucrats in pressed uniforms, accompanied by interpreters. When Thach presented his conclusions, one of them interrupted. Comrade Captain, your tone is overly admiring of the enemy. Perhaps you are too impressed by their gadgets. Thach kept his composure. Comrade, I am impressed by their system, not their gadgets. They build an aircraft like we build ideology, all-encompassing, self-reinforcing. Their engineers design with confidence because their factories never stop. The official frowned. Are you suggesting socialism cannot compete? Thach paused before answering. I am suggesting that socialism must learn to compete. Their technology reflects organization, not just wealth. We cannot defeat such organization with slogans alone. There was an uncomfortable silence. One of the Soviet translators looked away. Thach realized, in that moment, that his words would never appear in any official record. The truth, once again, was inconvenient. That evening, he walked to the edge of the airfield. The wreck of the Thunderchief still lay there, half covered with tarps. He touched its fuselage, cold now, pitted with shrapnel scars. He whispered, half to himself, "You were never just a plane. You were an equation, and we are still trying to solve it." The moon reflected faintly on the dull titanium surface, and for a moment, he saw in it not the enemy's machine, but the reflection of a world divided by more than politics, divided by capacity, by the invisible mathematics of production. Somewhere far away, he imagined, another Thunderchief was already being tested, its engine howling like a god of metal, born from an assembly line that no bomb could silence. The months that followed were a blur of air raids and counterattacks, each one seemingly more brutal than the last. The North Vietnamese air defense forces had grown more proficient with the help of the Soviet SAMs, and the MiG-21s, though agile, remained outmatched by the relentless wave of American air superiority. Captain Nguyen Van Thach had seen it all, the flashes of explosions in the distance, the thundering of bombers overhead, the wreckage of planes, both American and Vietnamese, scattered across the earth like broken toys. But the most profound change was happening within him. His initial hope that the war could be won with tactical brilliance, bravery, and guerrilla strategies began to dissipate as he watched the unrelenting march of American industry. One morning, as the sound of incoming jets rattled the windows of his command post, Thach sat hunched over his desk, reviewing the latest intelligence reports. The numbers were staggering. The United States had delivered another 200 aircraft to South Vietnam in the last 2 weeks. Despite the heavy losses in the bombing campaigns, the Americans seemed to have no shortage of planes. They could afford to lose hundreds of planes a month, replacing them with ease. His mind wandered back to that day in late 1967, when he had first encountered the F-105. At that moment, he had understood that it was not just the power of the engine or the complexity of the avionics that made the Thunderchief so formidable. It was the sheer industrial might that had given birth to it. A factory in Texas could turn out hundreds of these machines in a year. The United States was fighting a war of attrition, not just with bombs and bullets, but with factories. But here in Vietnam, the story was different. The war was being fought on 2 fronts, one with bravery and the other with ideology. North Vietnam had bravely resisted for years against colonial powers, first against the French and now against the Americans. But ideology alone, Thach began to realize, was not enough. The American machines of war, the factories, the assembly lines, the supply chains, had no ideology. They simply worked. The war had become, in his mind, a contest of mathematics, of logistics and industry. The Americans could not be defeated by air combat alone. They had the resources to endure. The war was not about defeating their airplanes, but about winning in a different dimension, the dimension of production, resources, and industrial might. It was February 1968, and the Tet Offensive was underway. North Vietnamese forces, bolstered by the Viet Cong, launched a massive coordinated attack across South Vietnam. While the American military focused on repelling the offensive, American aircraft continued their missions, dropping bombs, clearing paths, bombing targets in the heart of Hanoi. The sky was a battlefield, and Thach had a front-row seat to it all. The war had become a cat-and-mouse game, with North Vietnamese pilots using hit-and-run tactics, striking quickly, avoiding engagements with the American jets. But still, the disparity between the two sides was impossible to ignore. Thach had watched one of his best pilots, Lieutenant Ben, go down in flames after a high-speed chase with an F-105. The MiG-21 was fast and maneuverable, but it could not match the range and payload of the American bombers. In a confrontation at high altitude, the MiG was a sitting duck, and yet the Americans didn't seem to care. The United States, with its advanced radar systems, its long-range missiles, and its overwhelming production capabilities, was turning Vietnam into an industrial battlefield. They could lose dozens of planes each day and simply replace them. The North Vietnamese, on the other hand, had limited resources. Each MiG-21 lost was a setback that took months to recover from. By mid-1968, Thach's assessment was not just a technical analysis. It had become a personal burden. He had no illusions anymore. The war was being lost, not on the battlegrounds, but in the factories. Each day, he felt the weight of it more. He could feel the limitations of the North Vietnamese industrial base pressing down on him. The factories were small. The resources stretched thin. Despite the ingenuity and bravery of the pilots and engineers, they could never match the overwhelming American industrial machine. The F-105's, B-52s, and the relentless stream of American aircraft were a tide that could not be stopped. Thach had not seen the full extent of this industrial power until he visited the Northern Front, where Soviet advisors had established new SAM sites. There, he had the opportunity to observe a captured American pilot, Lieutenant Michael Dunn, who had been brought in after his plane was shot down. Dunn was a young man, barely older than Thach's own son, and in his eyes, Thach saw no fear, only the quiet recognition of a soldier who had played his part in a larger game. "I have no idea why you people are so determined," Dunn said through an interpreter, his voice calm. "The truth is, we don't need to win every battle. We just need to outlast you." It was a simple statement, but it struck Thach like a hammer. The Americans did not need to win every battle. They needed to win the war of attrition, the war of factories, of machines that could be replaced in days, of resources that could never be exhausted. And at that moment, Thach understood, this was not just a war of soldiers, but a war of systems. The American system of mass production was simply too powerful to be overcome by tactics alone. The Tet Offensive had been a temporary success for the North Vietnamese in terms of morale, but the long-term effect was a crippling realization. Even as the North had inflicted significant casualties on American forces, the United States had simply absorbed the losses. By mid-1969, American aircraft sorties had increased, and the F-105's continued their missions, unperturbed by the loss of hundreds of planes. Thach's thoughts grew darker as he considered the scale of the American operation. Production figures, provided by Soviet intelligence, painted a picture that was nothing short of devastating. The U.S. was producing more aircraft per month than North Vietnam had produced in its entire history, and the production was only accelerating. Thach knew that as long as the Americans had the resources and the factories, they would continue to pump out new weapons, not just airplanes, but tanks, trucks, missiles, and supplies. As the years wore on, the North Vietnamese forces continued to inflict heavy losses on American units, and yet the overwhelming strength of U.S. logistics and air power was becoming undeniable. The idea of winning through a war of attrition was fading. Thach's reports had become clearer. They were fighting a losing battle against the machinery of American industry. In 1975, the war ended with the fall of Saigon. Nguyen Van Thach, now a colonel, watched as the remnants of the North Vietnamese forces, victorious in their struggle for independence, surveyed the wreckage of a war that had been fought, not only with guns and planes, but with factories and resources. He knew, even as the streets of Hanoi filled with celebrations, that victory had come at an immense cost. The North had won its independence, but the price had been steep. The lessons Thach had learned over the years stayed with him. In the end, it was not the courage of individuals, nor the strategies of war, that had decided the conflict, but the invisible force of industrial power. The Americans had lost the battle for Vietnam, but their victory over the North had already been sealed on the production lines. In his final report to his superiors, Thach summarized the grim reality he had come to understand. The United States fought not only with technology, but with the sheer weight of its industrial might. We could never match their factories, their systems of production. This war was never about bravery alone. It was a war of capacity, of machines that outnumbered men, and systems that could not be defeated by ideology. As the years passed and the war became a distant memory, Thach would reflect on those final months in Vietnam. The Americans had built planes and bombs with the same ease that they built cars and refrigerators. They had fought with everything they had, and what they had, in the end, was more than any nation could overcome. And as the stars of Hanoi twinkled in the evening sky, Thach realized the bitter truth. The war had never been won in the skies above Vietnam. It had been won in the factories of Detroit and Los Angeles, in the assembly lines of a nation whose resources were infinite and whose industry was unstoppable. The war had been lost long before it had even begun.